if somebody committed something that was either a religious offense or a social offense, the only option was to execute them in this society. This is just not a society where prisons were part of the culture.
It sounds kind of brutal to me.
Well, it was a brutal world. I mean, it's very easy for us, sort of in our comfortable 21st century world to read these ancient texts, and I get a lot of students who do this as well and say, "Oh, they were so violent," or "They were so this," or this. But it's hard to imagine the world in which this was produced. I mean, this is a world in which your daily existence was a matter of harsh physical labor. Your continued ability to live on your land and enjoy your family was constantly threatened by the potential for outside invaders, whether they were simply raids from another town or conquest from another kingdom. And conquest meant, what war means, and I think that we're a little bit more aware of this in our world now because of the media, but it means, people coming in, taking your children, selling them into slavery, raping your wives, killing your men. These were realities that these people lived with. Not to mention just sort of the daily reality of slaughtering your own meat. Death was part of every person's daily existence, and the threat of death and the threat of violence. So it's a very different world from our own in that sense. Death as the ultimate punishment probably served to keep people in line in ways that maybe prison wouldn't have.
I think that was a really good explanation. And I often wondered why the Hebrew Bible seems so violent, and you just explained it.
Great.
I always wondered about that. My God, the horror of it.
Right, and it's one of those things, I mean, when we think of the Bible as kind of our own book, right? It's a book that's part of our culture, and that's very true. But one of the things that we wanted to convey in our book was that it may belong to us in a religious sense, but it's the product of a very different place and time. And so the values and the ideals that are expressed in it aren't always going to be consonant with what we would want them to be in our society.
Although I liked a lot of the values about the way you treat animals, the way you kill animals, that seems still true to me today. Just That's where the humane part came in to me, just the way that's all expressed. What was your major discovery about the death penalty?
Well, I'd have to say it was the idea that that there really was no alternative, that there weren't prisons for whatever reason, and we can come up with ideas about that, but we just don't know because the text doesn't tell us, and none of the other ancient writings from that place and time tell us why there were no prisons, but there weren't.
How do you know?
Well, we go through various texts where the word might be translated as prison or where someone is held in custody. And we find that in all of those texts, there's no sense or there's no suggestion or implication that that these people are going to be held sort of in perpetuity or as a punishment in itself. They're sort of held awaiting the judgment of their punishment, but nobody expects in any of these writings that people will be held as punishment.
Did the part on capital punishment challenge you about your own views on capital punishment? For example, where we are today in America and maybe in other places?
In some ways, it challenged, I would have to say it challenged my thinking about the biblical period, but in a lot of ways, I approach this text, and here I really can't speak for my co-author, but personally, I approached the biblical text very much as a product of an ancient civilization, and it's very intriguing to me that it is so influential today, but I can't say that it informs directly any of my own decisions on any of these matters. So in a sense, I might be more vilified by the people who would be my readership, who would who do use the Bible. And on the other hand, I think that it gives me a certain amount of academic objectivity.
Understood.
I really do read the text and try to understand what they meant, and my own views are really can't influence my reading of the text in that way.
And now for abortion. I'm sure you probably didn't want to deal with this one, did you?
Well, actually, Richard had written an op-ed piece on abortion a year or so before we even started collaborating on the book, and the part where we discussed Jeremiah's wish, it was originally an op-ed piece that he wrote in the Jerusalem Post, and it got a lot of hate mail. So we were reluctant, on all of these issues, but particularly I think homosexuality and abortion are the ones that people are the most emotionally invested in, and the ones that we approached the most cautiously.
Do you have children yourself?
I do.
How many do you have?
I have 2 kids.
So when you went into this area, how did you stay dispassionate in order to examine it?
I guess I think about abortion in terms of, certain circumstances in which people might want to or feel the need to have an abortion. And I don't look at it as a global issue so much as a personal issue for every individual person. And of course, the reason we're including it in our book is that for many people for whom it is a personal issue, the Bible is the first place that they're going to try to find an answer to their dilemma. So that's the way we wanted to approach it.
You want to talk about it?
It's very interesting, of course, to a lot of people to find that abortion as such isn't really discussed at all anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. As scholars who study ancient texts, we were already familiar with the fact that infanticide was far more prevalent in the ancient world than abortion was. And we were also familiar with texts from Egypt and Mesopotamia and Greece that prescribed methods for aborting a fetus. So we knew that it was around and accepted in the ancient world. There were no sort of, there were few laws against it. What we were surprised to find is that in some of the law codes, that a woman who aborted a child was executed. And even when we found that, what was most surprising was that then the Bible doesn't echo that. There are no laws about abortion in the Bible. It's just simply, we know it was practiced in the ancient world. We know that, as I said, infanticide was far more common, and we say in the book that it's likely that it's because it was much more safe. Abortion methods often threatened the life of the mother. So we knew that it was practiced, and we also knew that there were no laws against it. So we wanted to investigate further. Well, where does the Bible even allude to it or hint at it, or how might we determine a modern interpretation of the Bible that would that would be informed by biblical perspectives on abortion? And so we start with the discussion of when life began, according to the biblical text, and we try to extrapolate that from a variety of biblical stories that deal with with birth and life, and then of course there's the Jeremiah text where he wishes that he had been aborted in his mother's womb. Is also important to discuss, not only because of the recognition that abortion existed, but that someone might be so miserable in their lives that they wish that they had never lived.
What does biblical text say about when life begins from its translation?
Well, the usual biblical understanding is that something is alive if it breathes. So, for example, the creation of the first human is described in Genesis 2:7 as, God fashioning a human from the dust of the ground and blowing into his nostrils the breath of life. And at that point, the human becomes a living being. That's the first text. If you're looking, if you're reading the Bible cover to cover, that's the first text you'll come across that discusses when life begins. But there are other expressions even within Genesis. Throughout Genesis, what you see is the idea that with breath is life.